Over the past few million years, our ancestors' gastrointestinal tract shifted from being like that of the great apes, a bulky, voluminous, large intestine suitable for breaking down vegetables and fruits, toward a system more like that of carnivorous animals. A smaller, large intestine not well suited for large amounts of plant matter, but a highly acidic stomach, and a longer small intestine designed to extract nutrients from animal foods. But this change didn't only affect our digestive systems, it also contributed to the development of our more advanced brains. This is an idea in evolutionary biology known as the expensive tissue hypothesis. And here's how it works. Digestion is a very energy intensive process. It might not seem like it requires a lot of energy compared to running a marathon, but think about that post Thanksgiving dinner food coma when you can barely get off the couch. That some lethargy and fatigue have less to do with the tryptophan in the turkey, with all your body's energy being shunted toward your digestive tract and away from your brain. For our hominid ancestors, it took a lot of energy for their intestines to break down massive quantities of tough, fibrous leaves and vegetation. But over time, as their digestive systems adapted to a diet heavier in animal foods, which are much easier to digest than fibrous plants, their bodies could devote less energy to breaking down food. Fortunately, this energy didn't just disappear. It went toward growing more complex brains. The brains we modern humans have now, capable of composing symphonies, writing novels, and launching satellites into orbit. They consume meat from all parts of their prey, including the organs. They cracked open bones and skulls to get at bone marrow and brain. We may cringe at the thought, but ounce for ounce, animal brains contain more DHA than salmon. So unlike squeamish 21st century folks, early men received ample DHA. Remember that these were wild animals, not ones grown in CFOs, so the risk of acquiring an infection was much lower than it is today. Owing to the total fat content of brain and the DHA content specifically, eating brain tissue would have enabled early humans to support even larger brains themselves, along with a larger body size. The progression from our prehistoric ancestors to anatomically modern humans required DHA, and DHA remains an essential component of our brains today. Remember, fats are essential structural components of all your cells, and DHA in particular is especially abundant in your brain. These days you get some EPA and DHA in your diet or through conversion from vegetable-sourced ALA. But compared to what your hunter-gatherer genes are adapted to, the amount is minuscule. The brains of modern humans are about 11% smaller than those of humans prior to widespread adoption of agriculture. Our paltry intake of EPA and DHA might be the reason why. Evolution outside of Africa. The genetic changes responsible for our capacity to make this conversion occurred more than 85,000 years ago before human migration out of Africa. In fact, the genetic change of an increased ability to convert ALA to EPA and DHA is likely what made it possible for humans to expand their small habitat farther across Africa and then beyond. Some researchers have even called this a game-changing event because it enabled rapid population expansion. These changes became fixed in those who remained in Africa, but did not remain in populations who settled in what is now Europe and Asia. For reasons we're about to discuss, modern humans in various locations throughout the world vary in their capacity to convert ALA to EPA and DHA. Like we said, we all have this capacity, but it's stronger in some people than in others. So what happened to early humans who ventured out of Africa? Anthropologists speculate that when our ancestors left Africa, they traveled along the coastliners, spreading across Europe and Asia and eventually crossing into the Americas via a strip of land that at the time connected what is now Russia and Alaska. Staying near the coastlines, their diet would have provided foods rich in EPA and DHA. Modern day Europeans and Asians lack the genes to make them good converters of ALA to EPA and DHA. This is the result of their ancestors not needing to make this conversion well, since they were the ones who stuck to the coastlines and were eating preformed EPA and DHA. The low ability of humans to convert ALA to EPA and DHA persisted throughout the ages, suggesting that EPA and DHA intake during the Paleolithic era was high enough for most of our ancestors that they were able to survive and reproduce without being good fat converters. Unfortunately, the standard American diet is low in EPA and DHA, but we still carry the genes of tribes accustomed to consuming high amounts of these. For modern humans, not enough time has passed for genes to adapt and to return to being good converters of ALA to EPA and DHA. For this reason, as discussed in Chapter 1, EPA and DHA should be considered functionally essential. Bottom line, just because we can make EPA and DHA from ALA doesn't mean we'll do it well enough to provide our bodies with sufficient amounts of them. We are better served by making sure to get some from our diet or from high-quality supplements. Wild foods. Paleolithic diet authorities S. Boyd Eaton and Melvin Connor noted that the chronic illnesses like heart disease, type 2 diabetes, and cancer, as well as mental disturbances like anxiety, depression, and bipolar disorder that plague the Western world today, are virtually absent in current-day hunter-gatherers who maintain their traditional diets and ways of life. This is true even for those who reach their 60s, so we can't put this down to hunter-gatherers' supply not living long enough to get chronic illnesses. In the industrialized world, even children are being diagnosed with type 2 diabetes, metabolic syndrome, and can become morbidly obese. So these issues have little to do with old age. Eaton and Connor's research indicates that late Paleolithic humans consumed around 3,000 calories a day, with 65% of that coming from vegetables and the remaining 35% coming from wild game meat. However, a group of researchers led by Lauren Cordain, another expert in Paleolithic nutrition, found nearly the opposite. Their study of 229 hunter-gatherer tribes showed that on average, a whopping 68% of total calories came from animals, with just 32% coming from plants. Disparities in these figures may be due to variations in the proportion of plants and animals among tribes living in different locations. For example, those living in warmer climates would have consumed more plant foods. Those in colder areas likely consumed more animals. In either case, what's clear is that early humans' diets contained both plants and animals. Alpha-linolenic acid is highly concentrated in green leafy plants. The omega-3 content from ALA in green plants outweighs the omega-6 by around 3 to 1. For a long period of time, in terms of vegetation on Earth, green leafy plants were the main game in town. The muscle meat of land mammals contains between 2 and 5 times as much omega-6 as omega-3, and their fat tissue is closer to being even, about a 1-to-1 ratio. Wild plants have the opposite ratio. More omega-3 than omega-6, about 3 times as much. In fact, so when looked at as a whole, the omnivorous diet of our Paleolithic ancestors, containing both wild plants and animals, had an omega-6 to omega-3 ratio of approximately 1 to 1, a perfect balance. But remember, the omega-3 in these plants and animals was in the form of LA, not the more important longer chains, DHA and EPA, that we obtain from seafood. We mentioned earlier that one of the changes that occurred to our modern food supply. One of the most recent, in fact, was the development of CFOs, where chicken, cattle, and pigs are inhumanely fed heavily contaminated GMO grain-based diets. Cordain's group determined that the ratio of omega-6 to omega-3 in the muscle meat of grain-fed cattle is over twice that of grass-fed cattle. The reason for this is that grains are seeds, and remember, seeds are high in omega-6, while grasses are higher in omega-3. Just like humans, cows are what they eat. When they eat a high omega-6 diet, their meat and fat become higher in omega-6. And this omega-6 is passed on to us when we eat the meat. Keep in mind, too, that the reason cattle are fed grain in feedlots is that it fattens them up quickly, much more quickly than if they were eating solely grass, as they are designed to do. Some of the fat they put on winds up inside their muscles, known as marbling. Sometimes we tend to look for in steak because we all know that fat equals flavor. Meat that comes from grain-fed animals has over twice as much marbling as that from grass-fed animals. Grain-fed animals also have more saturated fat than grass-fed due to their higher carbohydrate diet. Just as in humans, excess carbohydrate consumption in cattle seems to deposit more saturated fat on their bodies, but you never realize how much you had in common with CFO cattle. Comparison of fats from grain-fed animals, grass-fed animals, and wild game. CFO grain-fed animals have double the omega-6 to omega-3 ratio of grass-fed animals. CFO grain-fed animals have over twice as much fat marbling as grass-fed animals. Wild game animals have 2 to 4 times more omega-3 than grain-fed animals and 2 to 3 times more than grass-fed animals. But if you're not looking for marbling in your own body, you'll want to reduce the amount of omega-6 and increase the omega-3 in your diet. Ditching the seed oils we talked about in Chapter 1 is a good first step, and a good step 2 would be choosing lifelong grass-fed meats over animals that have spent any time in a CFO. If you're a hunter or are fortunate enough to have one in your family or circle of friends, you have access to an even more balanced source of these fats. Wild game meats such as elk and venison have 2 to 3 times as much omega-3 as grass-fed beef, making wild game a premier source of omega-3s. If wild game isn't an option for you, grass-fed beef, lamb, or bison in moderation are typically healthy options. Modern diet, modern disaster. Researchers estimate that the optimal makeup of fats in a healthy human diet should be a 6 to 1 ratio of monounsaturated MUFA to polyunsaturated PUFA to saturated fats SFA, respectively. That is, MUFA should be the dominant fat in your diet, with 6 times less PUFA and SFA. Under the PUFA umbrella, the optimal ratio of omega-6 to omega-3 is suggested as 1 to 1. How does our current diet stack up against this? It's believed that during Paleolithic times, total linoleic acid intake omega-6 was around 7.5 to 14 grams per day, but currently we consume twice this amount. We have the opposite story with omega-3 alpha-linolenic acid. During the Paleolithic era, we consumed as much as 15 grams a day, compared to an almost negligible 1.4 grams today, 10 times less. It's even worse for the EPA and DHA. Our current diet contains as much as 143 times less EPA and DHA, 100 to 200 milligrams, than Paleolithic humans consumed, 660 to 14,250 milligrams, and our Paleolithic genes still expect. Brian Peskin has also suggested that supplementing with grams of fish oil causes fish oil overdose, leading to cancer, heart disease, and diabetes. However, even if you consume high doses of fish oil, around 3 to 4 grams of EPA plus DHA per day, this would be considered an overdose. When compared to intakes during the Paleolithic times of up to 14,000 milligrams per day, or 14 grams per day. In fact, what we consider high dose fish oil nowadays actually falls somewhere in the mid-range of long-chain omega-3 intake of our Paleolithic ancestors. With their lower intake of omega-6 and much higher intake of omega-3, your ancestors had a very different ratio of these fats than you likely do today. And looking at total omega-6 to omega-3, the ratio of these fats we evolved on may have been as low as 0.79, but now we consume as much as 15 to 20 times more omega-6 than omega-3. Aside from being inundated with cheap sugars and refined carbohydrates, this explosion of omega-6 intake from refined seed oils is probably the most dramatic change in our diet since the advent of agriculture. When you look at things this way, it's no wonder so many people are suffering from some type of chronic disease. Digging a little deeper into linoleic acid, it may not be the overall amount of this omega-6 fat in your diet that's doing the most harm. It could be the form it takes. Linoleic acid is an essential fatty acid. Recall that when used in a nutritional context, essential means that something performs an indispensable biological function, and you can't synthesize it in your body. So you must get it from your diet. So it's not that linoleic acid is bad. You actually require it, but only small amounts. Things go haywire when you have far too much of it compared to omega-3, and also when the fat is damaged. There are 4 main factors that could damage a fat: heat, light, air, and pressure. And the form this damage takes is oxidation. Recall from chapter 1 that oxidation is responsible for causing chemical changes to fats, the fats in your foods, as well as the fats in your body. Omega-6 fats, as they were consumed by your ancestors, were protected from oxidation because they remained in their whole food form. Either animal fats are consumed as nuts, seeds, and other plant sources. This is not how we get our omega-6 today. The vast majority of omega-6 in your diet comes from the oils extracted from these seeds, especially corn, soybeans, cotton seeds, and sunflower kernels. During the extraction process, which was only recently created, the fats are exposed to all 4 damaging elements: heat, light, air, and pressure. So these oils are oxidized during production, and then they're bottled in clear plastic, often toxic containers that then sit on supermarket shelves where they're exposed to light yet again and continue to catalyze oxidative damage. What we end up with when linoleic acid is oxidized in something called oxidized linoleic acid metabolites, or oxalums for short. Oxalums have been implicated in causing or worsening many health problems, including chronic pain, cardiovascular disease, and liver and neurodegenerative diseases. You wouldn't want to drive your car across a rusty, rickety bridge where the metals have been oxidized, and you don't want to consume oxidized, damaged fats. What about saturated fat? Our current intake of saturated fat is around 40 grams a day, which is likely higher than during Paleolithic times. Dairy foods, which were not part of Paleolithic humans' diet, are rich in saturated fat. So that accounts for some of the increase in our modern food supply and the shift from reliance on wild game meat to grain-fed feedlot. Meat has also contributed to the higher saturated fat in our diet. This is a significant change, but you'll see in Table 3.1 that it isn't all that different from the other changes, except for 2. The most substantial changes in the modern food supply are the dramatic reduction in omega-3 intake and the resulting skewing of the omega-6 omega-3 ratio. Table 3.1 Comparison of estimated dietary fat intakes during the Paleolithic era and the modern industrialized diet. This table is an estimate of the dietary fatty acid intake per day. Change indicates the difference of current day intake versus the Paleolithic era. For example, there is an 8.5 to 10.7 fold decrease in ALA intake in the current day diet compared to that of the Paleolithic era. Dietary fat, LA, omega-6, Paleolithic era, 7.5 to 14 grams. Current day, 11 to 22.5 grams. Change, 23% decrease up to threefold increase. ALA omega-3 dietary fat. Paleolithic era, 12 to 15 grams, none from industrial seed oils. Current day, 1.5 grams, mostly from industrial seed oils. Change, 8.5 to 10-fold decrease. EPA and DHA dietary fat. Paleolithic era, 660 to 14,250 milligrams. Current day, 100 to 200 milligrams per day. Change, 3 to 142-fold decrease. Dietary fat, omega-6/3 ratio. Paleolithic era, 0.79. Current day, 15 to 20. Change, 19 to 25-fold increase. Dietary fat, saturated fat. Paleolithic era, 32 to 39 grams. Current day, 22 to 55 grams. Change, 1.8-fold decrease up to 1.7-fold increase. Dietary fat, industrial trans fat, 0 grams in the Paleolithic era. Current day, 5.4 grams. Change, entirely new in the modern diet, never part of the Paleolithic diet. Summary. Humans evolved on a diet of leafy green plants and game, with an omega-6 to omega-3 ratio of around 1 to 1. And whatever DHA and EPA they weren't able to get in their food, their bodies converted from plant-sourced ALA. As early humans ventured out of Africa, they stuck to the shore, where seafood is high in DHA and EPA. Their genes altered with this new diet, resulting in a decreased ability to convert DHA and EPA from ALA. Now we eat an omega-6 to omega-3 ratio of around 20 to 1. Our bodies are simply not genetically capable of handling this. As a result, we are seeing an increase in chronic disease and mental illness. With this in mind, the superfuel solution boils down to increasing dietary ALA, EPA, and DHA, avoiding industrial seed oils in favor of whole food sources of omega-6, and eliminating industrial trans fats. Chapter 4. Healthy fats, healthy people, reign in the runaway omega-6. In the previous chapter, we explored the role of omega-3 and omega-6 fats in human evolution, emphasizing that the Western diet, the one associated with cardiovascular disease, cancer, obesity, type 2 diabetes, and more, is higher in omega-6 and lower in omega-3 than the diet humans evolved on. For nearly the entire time humans have been on this planet, the consumptions of these vital fats were essentially equal. Now, though, our ratio is about 16 to 1 and in favor of omega-6. Besides just this dramatic change in ratio, the total amount of omega-3, EPA, and DHA in our diet is 10 times less than it was in Paleolithic times. As we'll see in this chapter, these changes have had devastating consequences for your health. One of the main reasons why has to do with something that's become a bit of a buzzword and health and nutrition headlines these days. Inflammation. When you hear the word inflammation, maybe flame comes to mind, and it should. Think of inflammation as a fire in your body. Although a little simplified, this isn't too far off the mark. It's heat, redness, swelling, tenderness, and pain. When you sprain your ankle or get a bad cut, the surrounding area swells. Becomes red, tender, and sometimes even warm to the touch. That's inflammation. Now, inflammation has gotten a bad rap recently, but the truth is it's a natural, necessary process. It's your body's response to trauma. It protects you by keeping damage localized to a small area instead of spreading to your entire body. Without inflammation, you could, in theory, bleed to death from scraping your knee in a bicycle accident. Inflammation only becomes a problem when it's severe, chronic, and unresolved. This is different from the kind of acute, short-lived inflammation that has important biological value and occurs when you stub a toe or accidentally cut yourself. Chronic, uncontrolled inflammation means that your body is constantly on fire. It might be limited to a specific type of tissue, like your joints or your skin, or spread throughout your entire body. As with coagulation, where clotting is kept from spreading outside of the damaged area by the resolving process of fibrinolysis, all inflammatory processes need to be properly coordinated with the onset of the resolving processes. There's always a reason for chronic inflammation, though it may not be readily apparent the way a broken arm is. Among other causes, chronic inflammation can result from undiagnosed food allergies or sensitivities, exposure to environmental toxins, or from the cause we're almost concerned with here, an imbalance in your dietary fats. Remember what we said in Chapter 3. Fats aren't just the stuff you love to hate on your hips and backsides. Fats are the building blocks for vital signaling molecules in your body. Signals that can either help promote or help resolve inflammation. You might have read somewhere that omega-3s are anti-inflammatory and omega-6s are pro-inflammatory, but that's a bit misleading. Omega-3 and omega-6 fats can both serve as building blocks for pro and anti-inflammatory compounds. It's not one or the other. Generally speaking, though, omega-3s produce more anti-inflammatory compounds, while omega-6s produce more pro-inflammatory compounds. And since the Western diet is so heavily skewed toward omega-6, many live in a constant state of inflammation, as if their body is constantly awash in damage and injury. But all that's really going on is excessive omega-6 and insufficient omega-3. So what happens when your body is inundated with arsonist omega-6 without omega-3 to put out the fires? Chronic inflammation, which has been linked to rheumatoid arthritis, psoriasis, inflammatory bowel disease, hypertension, arteriosclerosis, allergies, cancer, and more. Populations around the world with a low dietary omega-6 to omega-3 ratio experience extraordinary health. Whether they live in warm climates or cold ones, in the Arctic or on tropical islands, or have a diet that's predominantly animal foods or predominantly plants, what these healthy groups all have in common is a low omega-6 intake coupled with an abundant omega-3. Let's look at some of these in more detail.